active self, from aspiration to resignation. The place of John Wesley in the religious history of the West is a secure one. A major figure in 18th century English religion, his career as an evangelist, reformer, and founder of an important religious movement has had an influence reaching far beyond both his century and his country. Few men of the England of his day have received such widespread and continuing interest. With only a few exceptions, Wesley has had more biographies and other studies written about him than any other Englishman of the 18th century. Given the interest of the psychohistorian in personal documents, it should be reiterated that we have more autobiographical data on Wesley than on any other leader in the history of the Christian Church. Beginning with his first conversion in 1725, he kept a narrative record of the meaningful events of his life. Add the richly autobiographical correspondence, and it becomes clear that Wesley is an ideal subject for psychohistorical investigation. Indeed, the historical importance of the figure and the accompanying availability of personal data invites the scholar to undertake a full-length psychohistorical narrative of the entirety of the leader's life. The purpose of this chapter and the two which follow represent a far less ambitious undertaking. In these essays, we will carefully limit our focus to certain interpretive problems which, though of fundamental importance to any larger psychohistorical study of Wesley, relate closely to the problem of authority in Wesley's life and thought. Let us now turn to the first of these interpretive problems and to the psychohistorical analysis from which we hope to glean insights into the structure and dynamics of authority in the life and thought of John Wesley. The interpretive problem. In his critical and comparative study of Wesley biographies written since 1850, Herbert Loring has noted that the principal areas of Wesley's life which have led to conflicting interpretations by biographers have been, quote, the King William episode, the sinner at Charterhouse, the nature of holy orders, the identity of Berenice, the conversation with Spangenberg upon arriving in Georgia, the Sophie Hopkey affair, the conversion of 1738, field preaching, the Grace Murray affair, Mrs. Wesley, and Wesley's funeral services, unquote. Our analysis in this chapter will deal with materials which have relevance to the interpretation of all of these areas, but which will focus on the important interrelationship between two of them, the conversion of 1738 and the beginning of field preaching. The eminent Wesley scholar Albert Outler, in a response to a query regarding important issues in a psychohistorical analysis of Wesley, has posed the interpretive problem which will occupy us in this chapter. Quote, your real problem, I would suggest, is to explain how it happened that Wesley's achievement and impact up to his 37th birthday, June 1739, were negligible. If he'd died at any time before, he'd not rate even a footnote in the history books. After that, wow. But what happened, and how? Aldersgate doesn't explain it, really. Moreover, there are no decisive mutations in the substance of his theology or his large assortment of bias and predilections. It was a full year after Aldersgate before the real Mr. Wesley, the leader of the revival, stood up. And all the rest of his life he retained a neurotic character structure that would be a shrink's happy hunting ground. Unquote. Outler, in his John Wesley, has summarized the conclusions which underlie the above statement. While other biographers and Wesley scholars have emphasized the Aldersgate experience as the turning point in Wesley's life, Outler notes that the experience is actually one of a series of significant experiences and is, quote, neither first nor last, nor most climactic. The Aldersgate experience was followed by a, quote, long series of spiritual upheavals and frustration, which lasted well into the spring of 1739. According to Outler, it was the journey to Bristol which brought Wesley to the threshold of his true vocation. Wesley's field preaching at Bristol was met with an almost unbelievable positive response. The great crowds were obviously deeply affected by his preaching, and the experience marked not only the beginning of the revival, but the full maturing of the revivalist as well. Outler has characterized this change in Wesley, quote, it is most impressive to observe the marked effect this success at Bristol had on Wesley's spiritual equilibrium. Up to this point, the story is full of anxiety, insecurity, futility. Hereafter, the instances of spiritual disturbances drop off sharply, and rarely recur. Even in the full records of a very candid man, for the next half-century, in failure and in triumph, tumult and peace, obloquy and fame, the picture rarely varies. A man with an overmastering mission, acutely self-aware, but rarely ruffled, often in stress, but always secure on a rock-steady foundation. Outler has posed the question for us by describing the remarkable changes which took place in Wesley's life in the months between his return from Georgia and the beginning of the field preaching. Our task in this psycho-historical analysis is to offer some insights into the how of this transformation. Erickson and the interpretive conceptuality. Those familiar with Erickson's studies of Luther and Gandhi are aware of the usefulness of his concepts and insights in the interpretation of the formation of personal and vocational identity. Clearly, in Erickson's terminology, the events which Outler has described mark the formation of Wesley's mature ego identity. Let us examine briefly some of the psychological and historical dynamics which are involved in the formation of such a mature ego synthesis, or ego identity. Erickson has summarized the three elements of the process by which a person's individuality comes into existence and maintains continuity over time. Quote, the first of these is the biological process, by which an organism comes to be a hierarchic organization of organ systems, living out its life cycle. The second is the social process, by which the organisms come to be organized in groups which are geographically, historically, and culturally defined. What may be called the ego process is the organizational principle by which the individual maintains himself as a coherent personality with a sameness and continuity both in his self-experience and in his actuality for others. Unquote. While the interaction of the processes described here apply to all stages of the life cycle, Our attention will be focused on the interrelation of these processes in the individual's task of identity formation in adolescence and early adulthood. For Erikson, the concept of personal identity means more than simply an individual's name and station in the community. It includes a subjective sense of continuous existence and coherent memory. And the broader term psychosocial identity points to a more complex integration of elements at once subjective and objective, individual and socio-historical. Not only does one have to develop the subjective sense of identity, a sense of sameness and continuity as an individual, but this sense of being aware of one's individuality and continuity as a self must be shared and confirmed by others in the objective external world. For Erikson, the development of a mature psychosocial identity requires, quote, a community of people whose traditional values become significant to the growing person even as his growth assumes relevance for them. A community of people whose traditional values become significant to the growing person even as his growth assumes relevance for them. Psychosocial identity thus depends on a complementarity of an inner ego synthesis and the individual and of role integration in his group. Unquote. The development of a psychosocial identity cannot be completed before adolescence and becomes indispensable at the end of adolescence when, quote, the grown-up body grows together, when matured sexuality seeks partners, and when the fully developed mind begins to envisage a historical perspective and seeks new loyalties, all developments which must fuse with each other in a new sense of sameness and continuity. Unquote. At this time, identifications made in childhood must find some successful integrative alignment with urgent, yet often tentative new self-identifications and role choices. The magnitude of this synthesizing task is experienced by the individual leads to what Erikson has called an identity crisis. Identity, therefore, is not merely the sum of childhood identifications or simply an additional set of identifications. Identity formation begins, quote, where the usefulness of identification ends. Identity formation begins, quote, where the usefulness of identification ends. It arises from the selective repudiation and mutual assimilation of childhood identifications, and their absorption in a new configuration which in turn is dependent on the process by which a society, often through sub-societies, identifies the young individual, recognizing him as somebody who had to become the way he is and who being the way he is taken for granted. Unquote. Thus, while the end of adolescence is marked by an overt identity crisis, identity formation cannot be said to begin nor end with adolescence. Rather, it is a lifelong process of development which is largely unconscious to both the individual and his society, and which has roots which reach back to the earliest beginnings of self-recognition and mutual recognition in infancy. The growing child must develop a sense of awareness that his individual way of mastering experience, his ego synthesis, is a successful variant of a group identity, one in accord with the group's space-time and life plan. The self-esteem engendered by this growing sense of mastery in the synthesizing task, gradually grows into the conviction that the ego is capable of integrating effective steps toward a tangible collective future, that it is developing into a well-organized ego within a social reality. The process of identity formation then emerges, quote, as an evolving configuration, a configuration which is gradually established by successive ego syntheses and resyntheses throughout childhood. It is a configuration gradually integrating constitutional givens, idiosyncratic libidinal needs, favored capacities, significant identifications, effective defenses, successful sublimations, and consistent roles. Unquote. In order to differentiate this maturing configuration of identity from simple personal identity, Erikson has named this emerging psychosocial identity ego identity. Ego identity, then, in its subjective aspect, is the awareness of the fact that there is a self-sameness and continuity to the ego's synthesizing methods, the style of one's individuality, and that this style coincides with the sameness and continuity of one's meaning for significant others in the immediate community. Thus, the emerging ego identity bridges the early childhood stages when the body and parent images were given their specific meanings, and the later stages of adolescence when a variety of social roles becomes available and increasingly coercive. Here, the objective aspect of the task of the formation of ego identity becomes critical. The individual must find an appropriate ideology, a systematized set of ideas or ideals grounded in a communal orientation, which can lend support to the developing wholeness of identity, and an appropriate role to which he can commit himself and find in the development of a personal and or professional vocational identity an outlet for those developing capacities for loyalty and competence, which Erikson has termed fidelity. Quote, fidelity, when fully matured, is the strength of disciplined devotion. It is gained in the involvement of youth in such experiences as reveal the essence of the era they are to join, as the beneficiaries of its tradition, as the practitioners and innovators of its technology, as renewers of its ethical strength, as rebels bent on the destruction of the outlived, and as deviants with deviant commitments. Unquote. Thus, the formation of ego identity is based on a new set of processes of identification with both significant persons and ideological forces, giving importance to the life of the individual by relating it to a living community and to ongoing history, and engaging the newly developed individual identity with some communal solidarity. Here, then, life history intersects with history. Individuals are confirmed in their identities, and societies may be regenerated in their lifestyle. To enter history, according to Erikson, each individual must find an identity, personal and vocational, which is in some way consonant with his own childhood and perceived traditions, and with an ideological promise in the perceptible historical process. The onset of the identity crisis marks the coming of the time when the individual feels forced to choose between the various available and socially meaningful models for a workable combination of his identification fragments. Now his ego must subsume in fewer and fewer images a personified gestalten, the fragments and loose ends of all infantile identifications. The usefulness of the various models which he has at his disposal depends on the way in which they simultaneously meet the requirements of his maturational stage, his own style of adaptation or egosynthesis, and the demands of his culture. The prime danger of this crisis is the threat of identity confusion, the state of being bewildered by the plethora of images and feeling, unable to formulate and appropriate The prime danger of this crisis is the threat of identity confusion, the state of being bewildered by the plethora of images and feeling, unable to formulate an appropriate and workable synthesis. And the more numerous the available models for personal, occupational, sexual, and ideological commitments, the more difficult the task of formulating an appropriate and workable ego identity. According to Erikson, the onset of identity confusion can manifest itself in, quote, excessively prolonged moratoria. Hamlet offers an exalted example. In repeated attempts to end the moratorium with sudden choices, that is, to play with historical possibilities, and then to deny that some irreversible commitment has already taken place, and sometimes also in severe regressive pathology, unquote. In Erikson's terminology, a moratorium is a period of delay granted to an individual by his society in which he does not have to take on irrevocable adult commitments. It may be characterized by provocative playfulness or deep, if transitory, commitment by the youth. It may not be consciously experienced as a temporary commitment. Rather, the individual may feel deeply committed and learn only much later that what he had taken so seriously was in fact only a period of transition. When he is ready, and hopefully not before, the moratorium ends in a more or less ceremonial confirmation of commitment on the part of society. The final identity, as formulated at the beginning of responsible adulthood, is superordinated to any single identification with individuals of the past and to any fixed model for identity. It includes all significant identifications, elements of one or more identity models, and picks up the threads of various aspects of the cultural and familial traditions of the individual. The final synthesis, then, is firmly grounded in the identifications, models, and traditions of the individual's past. Yet, through the process of identity formation, he has been able to transform them, to make them his own, in order to fashion a unique and reasonably coherent whole. The process described above, then, is a conceptualization and psychological terminology of the personal and religious pilgrimage, which culminated in Wesley's commitment to the vocational role of evangelist and leader of the Methodist movement. We turn now to a reconstruction of the significant family tradition which set the stage for Wesley's quest for identity and of the events which can illuminate the unique structure and dynamics of that quest. Family tradition, the political milieu. John Wesley once told his friend Adam Clarke that, quote, if I were to write my own life, I should begin it before I was born, unquote. it is quite obvious that we too must begin before his birth. Some of the most important persons and events for understanding the development of his identity are, not surprisingly, found in the lives of his grandparents and parents before the time of his birth. We could not, of course, even begin here to sketch in any depth the lives and personalities of his grandfathers, to say nothing of the complex and intriguing Samuel and Susanna Wesley. We can, nevertheless, relate a few traits and events which can help us illuminate the influence prior generations had on the life of our subject. The history of England, both religious and political, in the century preceding the birth of John Wesley would be characterized as a century of intense authority conflict. This conflict had roots deep in the tapestry of the prior history of Europe, and became profoundly manifest in England with the break of Henry the Eighth in Rome, profoundly manifest in England with the break of Henry the Eighth with Rome, under both Henry and his daughter Elizabeth, 1558 to 1603. Countless Englishmen were executed over the question of the proper allegiance in matters religious and political. During the reign of Elizabeth, the lines of authority conflict took on a new front. In seeking to unite the English nation in an anti-Roman direction, she had allowed a freedom of belief and practice with the Anglican Church, which soon led to the growth of a strong Puritanism. The increasing strength and dissenting policies of the Puritans issued in 1567 in a split in the Anglican Church, with the Puritans separating and beginning to hold services in small private groups. Under James I, 1603 to 1625, and Charles I, 1625 to 1649, an open struggle against Puritanism became official Anglican Church policy. The policies of the Crown increasingly came to be interpreted as moving toward popery, and led to the Great Rebellion from 1642 to 1649. In 1649, Charles I was executed and Cromwell became the Puritan dictator. Yet in 1660 the pendulum moved back and the authority of the monarchy was restored with the beginning of the reign of Charles II. Charles renewed Queen Elizabeth's Act of Uniformity in 1662, followed it by the Conventicle Act of 1664 and the even harsher 5 Mile Act of 1665. These were frontal attacks on the Puritans, designed to re-establish Anglican authority, to break up Puritan congregations, and to keep Puritan ministers away from their former parishes. The successor of Charles II, James II, moved too far toward Roman Catholicism for comfort and was dethroned by the Revolution of 1688. William of Orange, a Protestant, changed the direction again in 1689 by issuing the Toleration Act. Yet intense authority conflict continued. The same non-jurors came to characterize those who did not believe that William of Orange had succeeded legally to the monarchy. The name non-jurors came to characterize those who did not believe that William of Orange had succeeded legally to the monarchy. Again, the question of allegiances took its toll as many clergymen refused to take the oath of loyalty to him and suffered in a manner much as the dissenters before them. William's successor, Queen Anne, once more began to promote a high church line, and the position of dissent was once more threatened as high church leaders, such as Sacheverell, questioned the validity of the Act of Toleration and the legality of the current ecclesiastical practice. That John Wesley's family and personal history was embroiled in these events of acute authority conflict in the English society will become evident in the following brief account of events in the lives of his grandfathers and parents. The authority conflict between the established church and dissent between jurors and non-jurors became an important part of Wesley's family tradition. Let us now turn to an examination of some of the agents of that tradition. The grandfathers. John Wesley's unorthodox approach to ministry had been brought to the attention of the Bishop of Bristol, and John was summoned before the bishop to give an account of his actions. The young minister gave his defense, emphasizing his biblical justification for his ministry, his determination to conform to the practice of primitive Christianity, the fruit of visible results, and the central aim of conversion. The bishop's response was to let the young man leave unhindered in his work. Those familiar with the career of John Wesley the evangelist might well think the account of the above event to refer to the encounter of Wesley with Joseph Butler, Bishop of Bristol, in 1739. In fact, the event recounted above is a much earlier encounter between Wesley's grandfather and the then Bishop of Bristol, Gilbert Ironside, in 1661. Wesley's biographer, Martin Schmidt, has noted that the event not only can be looked upon as a prelude to the grandson's later encounter, but that the theological and ecclesiological themes expressed during the interview are in many ways parallel to those of the grandson. That the later John Wesley had access to information about his grandfather seems clear. According to Nehemiah Kernock, it is probable that he may have used an empty book of his grandfather's to write down his own first attempts at journal keeping. Adam Clarke has also suggested that it may well have been the example of the grandfather that led young John Wesley to begin keeping a journal. It is certain, at any rate, that Wesley published the account of his grandfather's encounter in his own journal, supposedly from family papers. For our purposes, it should suffice to relate a few biographical notes on the life of John Wesley Sr. Born the son of a minister and physician, Bartholomew Wesley, in the year 1636, the first John Wesley matriculated at Oxford in 1651 and studied theology and the Oriental languages. Born the son of a minister and physician, Bartholomew Wesley, in the year 1636, the first John Wesley matriculated at Oxford in 1651 and studied theology and the Oriental languages. After receiving his Bachelor of Arts in 1665 and his Master of Arts in 1657, he became affiliated with a separatist congregation in Melcombe Regis. Receiving a commission from the group, he became a traveling teacher and preacher in the surrounding communities. In 1658, he became minister of the church at Winterbourne Whitechurch. As he was without episcopal ordination, this was a congregational call, which was in keeping with the local practice of the time. But 2 years later came the restoration of the Stuarts, and a faction within his congregation raised a question with the Bishop of Bristol regarding the legitimacy of his ministry. The encounter noted above was a result of this complaint. A complete account of the dialogue of the interview is found in Clarke's Memoirs of the Wesley Family. Though he had been promised that he would not be disturbed, the pressure upon him continued to increase until in August 1662 he had to leave the church. He found a small congregation at Poole, Dorsetshire, that desired to have him as its minister, but soon the Conventicle Act outlawed even that post. Repeatedly arrested, he continued his ministry as a traveling teacher and evangelist. Schmidt indicates that as a result of the hardships brought about by continuing persecution, Wesley died in a premature death in 1670. The maternal grandfather, Samuel Annesley, though in a much less dramatic way, was also prophetic of the famous grandson. One of the central intentions of the Act of Uniformity was to prevent any further ordinations of Presbyterian ministers in England. Some leading Puritan ministers were intimidated by this prohibition, but not the grandfather of John Wesley. He continued the practice of ordaining presbyters in secret until after the Revolution in 1688, and on June 22nd, 1694, he undertook the first public ordination of dissenting ministers in his meeting house at Little St. Helens. John Wesley was also going to find himself in a position in which undertaking Presbyterian ordination seemed required by the circumstances and justified theologically, though also a flagrant violation of established ecclesiastical law. On September 1st, 1784, John Wesley himself began to ordain ministers for the work of his movement in America. Born in 1620, Samuel Annesley was a member of the prominent aristocratic family and, like the two John Wesleys, was an Oxford graduate. Ordained in 1644, he was made a naval chaplain by the Earl of Warwick. After leaving the fleet, he had a surprisingly successful ministry at Cliffe in Kent, with a congregation notorious for its scandalous conduct. He then moved to London and served successfully the Church of St. John the Apostle and St. Giles, Cripplegate, two of the largest Puritan congregations in the city. Soon, however, he too suffered the consequences of the Act of Uniformity and was ejected from St. Giles in 1662. Unlike most in his situation, he was independently wealthy and did not suffer economic hardship. After his ejection, he preached for a number of small groups of dissenters and soon became the pastoral leader of a congregation at Little St. Helens. There he was successful in erecting a meeting house in which the group could hold their worship and other meetings. Samuel Annesley continued to be a prominent leader in dissenting circles until his death in 1696. Samuel Annesley continued to be a prominent leader in dissenting circles until his death in 1696. Like his famous grandson, he undertook a great deal of charitable work with the poor and sought to distribute Bibles and other literature to those who had none. He also published a volume of sermons dealing with the Puritan theology of conscience and the conscience-guided life. John Wesley was later to indicate his appreciation for the views of his maternal grandfather by publishing many excerpts from his sermons in A Christian Library, which according to Wesley represented, quote, the choicest pieces of practical divinity which have been published in the English language, unquote. No doubt Annesley's daughter, Susanna, the mother of John Wesley, was the chief agent of the transmission of his influence to John Wesley. With this introduction, then, let us turn to the children of dissent, Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Samuel and Susanna, renegades from dissent. Although both Samuel Wesley, 1662 to 1735, and Susanna Annesley, 1669 to 1742, were reared by courageous and committed dissenters, neither was content to remain within the camp of the Puritans. Samuel, at first, seemed to be following in the footsteps of his father by beginning studies for the ministry at a dissenting academy. Given an assignment to vindicate the righteousness of the cause of dissent, his research seemed to him to be a defense, not of dissent, but of the Anglican Church. Instead of facing the wrath of his Puritan relatives, he quietly packed and left for Oxford. Soon Samuel Wesley was hurling literary harpoons at dissent and its academies from the secure high Anglican foundation of Exeter College. It has been suggested by some scholars that Samuel's real motive for leaving the ranks of dissent was that he was ambitious and believed that real possibilities for success lay in the Anglican communion. But whether it was ambition or the appeal of the zealous royalist orthodoxy of Oxford, with its rich intellectual apprehension of the 17th century Anglican tradition, Samuel soon became a loyal Anglican and an, if not fanatic, then at least stern and often undiscerning opponent and critic of dissent. Whatever his reasons for leaving dissent, he found a willing compatriot in rebellion in the person of Susanna Annesley, the daughter of London's leading dissenter. They had met at a wedding in 1682 when Susanna was still in her early adolescence, but was already manifesting the independence and precocious mind in religious matters that were to mark her adulthood. Impressed by the cocksure young Samuel and by the intellectually impressive way in which he presented the case for Anglicanism, she left her father and his dissent to convert to the Anglican Church and marry Samuel in 1688. If Samuel was ambitious for a life of ecclesiastical preferment, and if Susanna believed the pretty picture which had undoubtedly been sketched of their future together, both were to be cruelly disappointed. After a brief stint as a naval chaplain, he was appointed to the small living of South Ormsby in 1690, and then to Epworth in 1695. Even when the living of nearby Root was added, the living was a poor one indeed. The couple was to spend the remaining 38 years of their life together in this obscure, poorly endowed assignment in the backwaters of the realm. Susanna was soon to discover that the Samuel she had chosen to marry was neither as gentle nor as effective a minister and provider as the first Samuel in her life. Though certainly possessed of a modicum of scholarly and poetic talent, she discovered that Samuel Wesley also possessed an arrogant manner and bearing which far surpassed in its claims the extent of his real talents and virtues. Even a fair and objective appraisal, which most have not been, must present her husband as a tremendously domineering yet ineffective man whose insensitivity to both his parishioners and family knew no bounds. An impractical man, and from all accounts an extremely poor ecclesiastical tactician, with regard both to the hierarchy and to his own parish, he found himself in a remote, undesirable parish, so poor that his family was always deep in debt and often hungry, and with parishioners that, given his personality and opinions, hated him with a venom. And this hatred went so deep that the parishioners, when unable to express their feelings sufficiently violently with him and the family, would maim his dogs and farm animals. They even went so far as to, during fits of rage, set the crops and rectory afire in an attempt to burn them out. In the midst of all this, Samuel remained the poetic dreamer, living more in his fantasies of greatness as a scholar or missionary than in the harsh realities of his parish or family responsibilities. He lived to see his scholarly writings and poetry published and circulated, and hoped at some future date to escape Epworth for the mission field. These dreams were bought at a high price to his family. His income, though small, would have been sufficient, through careful management, for even his large family. But such mundane matters were not for him, and were left to his wife Susanna, along with the responsibilities of raising the steadily growing family. It is not surprising, then, that Susanna's ability and independence in such a situation would add much to an already potent formula for domestic dissension. Authority and parental conflicts. In order to illustrate the way in which issues of authority and legitimacy manifest in myriad ways, were the foci of conflict in the family circle, we must examine three important areas in which the conflict became intense: the religious, the parental, and the political. In theological matters, Susanna and her husband seldom entered into a severe conflict. Both were orthodox in their positions, and a mutual respect facilitated their discussions. Ecclesiastical practice, however, was a different matter. Samuel's rejection of dissent had manifested itself in a rigid and unbending scrupulousness in terms of Anglican canon law. He applied the most insignificant detail of prescribed practice in his parish without regard for the discomfort or inconvenience it caused his parishioners. Their sympathy for a freer style in the mode of dissent, or for their traditional hatred of heavy-handed authority of any kind. Susanna was far more pastorally inclined and sensitive toward the parishioners. Her rejection of dissent, though irrevocable in most areas, was not so totalistic in character that she could not bend the rules when human need or the perceived will of God seemed to call for it. In later years, her flexibility would influence John Wesley in his willingness to use practices which reeked of dissent. But in the Epworth parish, such flexibility and sensitivity was suspect. When Samuel left for convocation in 1710, he left an incompetent curate in charge of the parish. Susanna began to hold a small prayer meeting on Sunday evenings for her children and servants. During these meetings, she would lead the singing of psalms, and read prayers, and deliver a short sermon, usually taken from the files of her husband. The services, however, soon became extremely popular with the parishioners, and soon more were attending her services than those held by the curate on Sunday mornings. The curate soon complained to her husband, and Samuel wrote to reprimand her, saying that there was no precedent for such practice, that the meeting smacked of a dissenting conventicle, and that they jeopardized the regular worship of the church. She answered this charge by pointing to the good that was being done, to the increase of goodwill among the parishioners toward the church and its ministry, and by asserting that the meetings could in no way be harmful. She closed her defense with the following appeal to her husband. Quote, "Now, I beseech you, weigh all these things in an impartial balance. On the one side, the honor of Almighty God, the doing much good to many souls, and the friendship of the best among whom we live. On the other, if folly, impiety, and vanity may abide in the scale against so ponderous a weight, the senseless objections of a few scandalous persons laughing at us and censuring us as precise and hypocritical. And when you have duly considered all things, let me have your positive determination. I need not tell you the consequences if you determine to put an end to our meeting. You may easily perceive what prejudice it may raise in the minds of these people, against Inman especially, who has so little wit as to speak publicly against it. I can now keep them to the church, but if it be laid aside, I doubt they will never go to hear him more, at least those who come from the lower end of the town. But if this be continued till you return, which will not be long, it may please God that their hearts may be so changed by that time, that they may love and delight in his public worship, so as never to neglect it more. If you do, after all, think fit to dissolve this assembly, do not tell me that you desire me to do it, for that will not satisfy my conscience, but send me your positive command in such full and express terms as may absolve me from all guilt and punishment for neglecting this opportunity of doing good, when you and I shall appear before the great and awful tribunal of our Lord Jesus Christ. Unquote. Thus, in effect, Susanna was defiant and would not discontinue the services unless he would put his full priestly and husbandly authority on the line in a command for her to desist. She indicated that while she would obey the full force of his authority, recognized by her as legitimate, she felt herself claimed by a higher authority, an authority which he would have to face and answer to if he ordered her to stop the meetings. Though he did not approve of her actions, the very forcefulness of her challenge put an end to his attempts to stop them. When he returned from convocation, the effectiveness of her work was evident in the goodwill which, from that point on, smoothed the relationships between the Wesley family and the Epworth parishioners. Other conflicts were not so brief in duration or so easily resolved through Samuel's reluctance to do battle. A constant source of friction between the parents was their conflict over the exercise of parental discipline and authority. In our discussion below of John Wesley's experience as a child in the Epworth parsonage, we will examine in some detail Susanna's account of the method she followed in the education of her children. It should suffice for our purposes here to note that she had developed a careful and comprehensive approach to rearing her children, which stressed subduing the onrush of impulse, and inculcated into the child an unquestioning obedience to a consistent and fair authority. Her method was expressed in a routine for every hour of the child's day and in rules which the child could grasp and to which he could accommodate himself. The very clarity of the rules for behavior and the patient consistency with which she enforced them were designed to help the child to develop his own capacity to reason and choose obedience, and through obedience, certain approval. Elsie Harrison has captured for us Samuel's response to his wife's method. Quote, "In this miracle effort of salvation for her children, Susanna Wesley could look for little help from her good husband. On the contrary, he had an unfortunate habit of putting sand in the workings of her dear, delightful method. He stalks between the lines of her letters as the agent of Bolshevism. Now Susanna had her fixed rules for the children's conduct, but her impetuous spouse would lose his temper and frighten her little Methodists quite out of their wits." Unquote. That this disagreement on how to exercise parental authority would have influence on the children is without doubt. We will come back to this discussion when we characterize John Wesley's experience in the family circle. With regard to political issues, the parents found themselves, if anything, disagreeing more violently than in other areas of contention. Samuel and Susanna found themselves on opposite sides in the controversy over the legitimacy of the claim of William of Orange to the throne. John Wesley's own words testify to the importance of this disagreement. Quote, "Were I to write my own life, I should begin it before I was born, merely for the purpose of mentioning a disagreement between my father and mother. 'Suki,' said my father to my mother one day after family prayer, 'why did you not say Amen this morning to the prayer for the king?' 'Because,' said she, 'I do not believe the Prince of Orange to be king.' 'If that be the case,' said he, 'you and I must part, for if we have two kings, we must have two beds.' My mother was inflexible. My father went immediately to his study, and, after spending some time with himself, set out for London, where, being convocation man for the Diocese of Lincoln, he remained without visiting his own house for the remainder of the year. On March 8th, in the following year, 1702, King William died, and as both my father and mother were regarded as to the legitimacy of Queen Anne's title, the cause of their misunderstanding ceased. My father returned to Epworth, and conjugal harmony was restored. Unquote. John Wesley's concise and calm account belies both the intensity of the conflict and his own anger about it. In a letter to a friend, Susanna expressed her worry over her husband's departure. Quote, "I'm more easy in the thoughts of parting because I think we are not likely to live happily together. I have 6 very small children, which, though he tells me he will take good care of, yet if anything should befall him at sea, we should be in no very good condition. I've unsuccessfully represented to him the unlawfulness and the unreasonableness of his oath, that the man in that case has no more power over his own body than the woman over hers, that since I'm willing to let him quietly enjoy his own opinions, he ought not to deprive me of my little liberty of conscience." Unquote. In fact, when Samuel returned home after some months, he intended to stay only long enough to pack more of his things. But the parishioners chose the time of his arrival to commit arson, and the rectory was set on fire. The attending crisis interrupted his plans, and after a tenuous reconciliation, he remained with his family. 9 months later, John Benjamin Wesley was born on June 17th, 1703. It's hard to believe, given Susanna's account and the circumstances leading to the reconciliation, that conjugal harmony either preceded or followed the episode. John Wesley learned of these circumstances leading to his birth from his father in London on November 30th, 1733. That John was angered by this is evident by his interpretation of the manifestations of the family poltergeist as being intended to bring home to his father the sinfulness of his desertion of his wife in 1702. Quote, "I fear his vow was not forgotten before God." Unquote. We have characterized the emotional climate of conflict in the Epworth parsonage. We now turn to the experience of John Wesley in that home. Wesley's experience in the family circle. Wesley's experience in the family circle. We are fortunate to have Susanna's own summary of the method which she used to raise her children in order that we might better understand that John Wesley's experience was like as an infant and young child. Better understand what John Wesley's experience was like as an infant and young child. The following sketch of her method will illustrate both the severity and the consistency of the maternal authority. From birth, the lives of the children were ordered according to a regular routine. There were definite times for eating, sleeping, and having a change of linen. At approximately 1 year of age, Susanna explains, they were taught to fear the rod and to cry softly, by which means they escaped abundance of correction which they might otherwise have had. They could eat and drink as much as they would at mealtime, but were not to call for anything. Drinking or eating between meals was never allowed, unless in case of sickness. After their supper, They were washed by 7 o'clock and in bed by 8. Obedience was the fundamental foundation and goal of child development. In order to form the minds of the children, the first thing to be done is to conquer their will and bring them to an obedient temper. To inform the understanding is a work of time, and must with children proceed by slow degrees, as they are able to bear it. But the subjecting the will is a thing which must be done at once, and the sooner the better, for by neglecting timely correction they will contract a stubbornness and obstinacy which are hardly ever conquered. When a child is corrected, it must be conquered. And when the will of a child is totally subdued, and it is brought to revere and stand in awe of the parents, then a great many childish follies and inadvertencies may be passed by. I insist upon conquering the will of children betimes, because this is the only strong and rational foundation of a religious education. Susanna was quite self-conscious regarding the religious implications of her method. She noted that self-will is the root of sin, and that the parent that encourages it is laying the foundation of the child's damnation. This is still more evident if we farther consider that religion is nothing else than the doing the will of God and not our own, that the one grand impediment to our temporal and eternal happiness being this self-will, no indulgences of it can be trivial, no denial unprofitable. Heaven or hell depends on this alone. Mrs. Wesley also noted a number of bylaws which were observed by her, several of which are of interest to us here. First, to prevent lying, a law was made if a child would confess his transgression of a rule and promise to amend, he would not be beaten. Second, that no sinful action would ever remain unpunished. Third, that no child would ever be scolded or beaten twice for the same fault, and if they did not continue the error, they were not to be upbraided regarding the transgression later. Fourth, that every act of obedience would be praised and often rewarded according to the merits of the particular case. And that fifth, if a child did anything with the intention to please or obey, even if the act lacked success in its intentions, the obedience and intention should be noted and the child helped in order to do better in the future. This discipline of the will was complemented by a discipline of the mind, manifest in an organized program for the education of the child, which occupied 6 hours of his day. This program emphasized reading, writing, and religion. We shall see in a later chapter how Susanna's role as tutor in theological matters for John Wesley would reach far beyond the confines of the Epworth nursery. If she was conscientious to a fault in her efforts with all of the children, the following event led her to be even more conscientious with John Wesley. On the night of February the 9th, in the year 1709, the Epworth parsonage was again on fire. This time, it was unclear whether the cause was arson or simply carelessness on the part of Samuel Wesley. Nevertheless, the fire was not discovered in time, and the entire family came close to losing their lives in the Holocaust. The fire spread so fast and the heat was so intense that no real attempt was made to rescue young Jackie from his bedroom. although his father did kneel and commit the child's soul to God. Thanks to the efforts of a friendly parishioner, however, young John was spotted at his bedroom window and pulled through to safety. His mother, overwhelmed with thankfulness at his miraculous rescue, thereafter referred to him as the brand plucked from the burning, and when she was alone made pious vows on his behalf. Quote, "I do intend to be more especially careful of the soul of this child," unquote. And careful she was. It should be helpful at this point to reflect on the special meaning that John was coming to have for his mother. Her dreams about having her own Samuel follow in the illustrious ministerial tradition of her first Samuel, though in a different communion, had undoubtedly been cruelly broken by the time of John's miraculous rescue. In this divine intervention, Susanna believed she had a sign, a portent of John's future stature as a man of God. If she had not been able to, with all of her ability and commitment, to enable Samuel Wesley to carve out a place of importance for himself, it had been because of weaknesses in his character. With care, she might be able to form a character in John without those debilitating weaknesses. We have already noted the impatience of Samuel Wesley with his wife's rigorous and consistent method of child-rearing. Harrison has characterized his response to the personality traits which this method was creating in John. Quote, "The star pupil, John Wesley himself, had an uncomfortable time with his father, for he got both beaten and laughed at for observing the rules too well. His mother had taught him to reason out everything, with the result that he debated every step of the way forward and made a man like his father very angry. A poet cannot be expected to tolerate too much reason. He would thunder at the child, 'You think to carry everything by dint of argument.' And turning to his mother, he followed up his advantage in that trying stain of crude banter. 'I protest, sweetheart, I think our Jack would not attend to the most pressing necessities of nature unless he could give a reason for it.'" No doubt, this early experience of conflicting styles of parental authority would constitute the beginnings of not only his special style of mastering experience, his ego synthesis, but also some of the basic parameters of his integrating task. During his experience under Susanna's method, John Wesley seems to have learned his lessons well. His personal style, as a Methodist, compulsive, over-organized, perfectionistic in his attempts to obey legitimate, just, and consistent authorities, was determined at an early age by this relationship. His sense of having a destiny, some special mission in religious leadership, was also fostered by the mother, leading to his strong belief in the providential element in his personal history. V. H. Green has noted that the dominance of Susanna led to an intense dependency upon her in all of the Wesley children, and that though in some respects the brothers were less tied, more especially Samuel as the eldest, but even in their development, the powerful, loving, counseling, and warning figure of Susanna Wesley was never far away. He concludes that two features, the femininity of his early environment and the thorough training to which he was subjected by his mother, were of the first importance in John Wesley's development. We will see in the next section of this essay how these two ingredients were to set the stage for a continuing struggle with the maternal authority in Wesley's life. Yet we do not want to minimize here, as many biographers have done, the importance of Samuel Wesley. in his son's developmental economy. The scholarly, poetic, volatile, unorganized, and eminently unpredictable figure of his father must have elicited a response from young John that had elements of both mysterium tremendum and mysterium fascinans. If it was impossible for John to have an unambiguously positive response to Samuel, neither was the response completely negative. Though all of the children suffered the capricious and often heavy hand of the father's authority, neither they nor their mother were willing to deny the formal legitimacy of that authority and its claim upon them. It's not an effective head of the household. If not an effective head of the household, he was a powerful presence for the children, emotionally, and had to be dealt with in their struggle to develop appropriate and autonomous ego identities. We will see below how John Wesley's own integrative task included not only the problem of struggling with a dominant mother, but also that of neutralizing the problematic potency of the capricious father, while also finding a place for him in his emerging identity. Wesley and conflict with maternal authority. John Wesley liked being with women. No doubt his early experience in the home had contributed to his enjoyment of female companionship, since until the birth of Charles in 1707, the household was predominantly female. His older brother Samuel Jr. was away at boarding school, and so John's early years were spent in a home dominated by his mother. And since his mother did not like for her children to mix with the other children of the parish, his playmates were for the most part his 7 sisters. V. H. Green has suggested the following as a manifestation of the influence of the sisterhood. Quote, "There was a decisive streak of femininity in John's character. His neatness, his meticulousness, at times fussy, concern with detail, his personal sensitivity, his histrionic approach, must have been in part conditioned at this early age. While he was well liked by his fellow men, he seems always to be more at home in female society." Unquote. These relationships with the women of his home allowed an intimacy with danger of passion or desire. Susanna had always characterized temptation to sinful willfulness as a personified female. Quote, "I am verily persuaded that the reason why so many seek to enter into the kingdom of heaven, but are not able to, is there is some Delilah, someone beloved vice, they will not part with." Unquote. Schmidt has noted the influence of 2 devotional books on Susanna Wesley, both Lorenzo Scopoli's Spiritual Conflict and Henry Scougal's The Life of God and the Soul of Man, were books which emphasize the goal of perfection in human life. And in both the will and the body must be subjected to reason and spiritual discipline. Susanna heard their warnings to be ever committed to the struggle for perfection and to withdraw from the things of the world, and she passed these concerns on to her children, and especially to John. The passions of the flesh and human sexuality, of course, ranked high among the temptations and were especially to be guarded against. Wesley left his Epworth home for Charterhouse, where he was to become a foundation scholar in 1714. There is little information about Wesley's experience at this boarding school, although Green has concluded in his John Wesley that the experience, quote, "has not modified to any perceptible degree the predominant influences of home life." Wesley left Charterhouse in 1720 and matriculated at Christ Church, Oxford, one of the most prestigious colleges in the university. In the following chapters, we will focus our attention on Wesley's experience at Oxford with regard to his theological development and his early experiments in religious leadership. Here, however, our attention continues to trace the strand of Wesley's relationships with the opposite sex. While at Oxford, Wesley delved deeply into the study of early church history and patristics. He no doubt found that their views on sex were, if anything, even more severe than those of his mother. Not only did they view as sinful sexual relations, not only did they view as sinful sexual relations which could in any way be termed promiscuous or irregular, but they included even the slightest thing that might encourage, quote, carnal feeling. Being away from Epworth at college, however, was not all study. While at Oxford, he became a part of a group of young men and women of his age which became a source of great enjoyment for him. Their friends were for the most part from the Cotswold villages of Stanton, Buckland, and Broadway. The center of the group was the Kirkham family. Mr. Kirkham was the rector of Stanton, and his children, Bob, Sally, Bet, and Damaris, were among John's closest friends. They were all very religious, and Sally introduced him to some very challenging devotional literature. He had more than devotions in mind, however, as is evidenced by his diary entry of April 14th, 1725. Quote, "First saw Veronese," his playful nickname for Sally. "May it not be in vain," unquote. Soon his mother's warning seemed not to apply to this relationship, and Sally's combination of youthful attractiveness and religious commitment led to John's falling very much in love with her. He began to entertain thoughts of marriage, but since he had only recently been ordained and was expecting soon to be made a fellow at Oxford, he was hesitant to raise the question with Sally. She had already been engaged to the local schoolmaster, and they were married within a few months. The marriage did not end their relationship, however, and convincing themselves that they would continue to relate as brother and sister, they kept up a relationship quite as intimate as before her marriage. In the fall of 1726, some months after her wedding, she told John, quote, "I would certainly tell you if my husband should ever resent our freedom, which I am satisfied he never will. Such an accident as this would make it necessary to restrain in some measure the appearance of the esteem I have for you. But the esteem as it is, grounded on reason and virtue, and entirely agreeable to us both, no circumstance of life will ever make me alter." Unquote. If Wesley was painted at having lost Sally as a potential bride, he rationalized that the continuing relationship was an important aid to religious commitment and virtue. He continued to reaffirm his commitment to their relationship. Quote, "You make me a little uncomfortable, and I think it is almost sinful to use the expressions of tenderness which I use in relation to you in relation to other people. It isn't expedient or right to break off our friendship. It is one of my main incentives to virtue." Unquote. One of Wesley's sisters, however, was wise to the source of the intensification of Wesley's religious zeal. Quote, "Had you not lost your dear Mrs. Kane, where had your love been fixed? Your dear Mrs. Redacted, where had your love been fixed? On heaven, I hope, principally, but a large share, too, had been hers. You would not have been so spiritualized, but something of this lower world would have had its part in your heart, wise as you are. But being deprived of her, there went all hope of worldly happiness. And now the mind, which is an active principle, losing its aim here, has fixed on its maker for happiness." Unquote. Wesley was to continue his relationships with the Cotswold circle for some time, and we will discuss another important feminine companion from that same group below. Yet another important relationship must be noticed which developed in Epworth. In the summer of 1726, Wesley spent several months with his family at Epworth. Recently named Fellow of Oxford, he had been granted a leave of absence before assuming his duties again in September. The summer was an enjoyable one for the young Wesley, and he found a number of diverse activities which interested him and provided a pleasant contrast to the Oxford academic life. At Epworth, he found time to help with the family's chores, including transcribing on his father's job. He read, hunted, composed poetry, and even participated in an archaeological expedition. For our purposes, however, the summer is of focal significance for its manifestation of Wesley's conflict with both maternal and paternal authority. The conflict with maternal authority is evident in his relationship with the young woman of the parish, and that with paternal authority in what we shall denote below the Hetty incident. Apparently, Wesley's disappointment in his relationship with Sally Kirkham had not caused him to lose interest in attractive young women. During the summer, Wesley began to see a great deal of a local girl, Kitty Hargraves, and from all accounts was becoming quite fond of her. His diary for the summer contains many references to her, some quite revealing of both his attraction to her and his conflict over that attraction. Green has suggested that the course of the relationship with Kitty parallels that with Sally Kirkham the year before. First, Wesley is attracted to a young woman. Then, he becomes hesitant as he experiences the relationship as a conflict between attraction and conscience. On the 3rd of July, Wesley wrote, quote, "As we would willingly suffer a little pain or forego some pleasure for others we really love, so if we sincerely love God, we should readily do this for him. For this reason, one act of self-denial is more grateful to our Master than the performance of many lesser duties. Begin in small things first." Unquote. And then he writes in his personal shorthand code, quote, "Never touch Kitty's hand again." Unquote. Evidently conscience was having a real struggle, for on a Saturday night in August he made a resolution that he would never touch any woman's breast again. Nevertheless, though Wesley continued to see Kitty for the rest of his stay, the relationship was not to deepen or become intense. Yet, in spite of his disappointment with Sally Kirkham and his stillborn relationship with Kitty Hargraves, on his return to Oxford, Wesley had not lost his interest in intimate relationships with attractive young women. As we have noted above, he continued seeing Sally Chapone, Kirkham, who was now not a threat to his conscience, but rather simply a beloved religious friend. Now, however, another member of the Cotswold circle, the young widow, Mary Pendarvis, Asperia, began to occupy more and more of his attentions. She, too, was regarded as a fellow religious pilgrim, and his correspondence is marked by expressions of his admiration of her traits of holiness and virtue. In this relationship, we see no evidence of the threatening physical intimacy Yet, in spite of the predominantly religious subject matter of the correspondence, Schmidt has noted that, quote, "The letters which Wesley exchanged with her are a peculiar mixture of pastoral pronouncements and repressed eroticism. His words are prompted by sentiment in a way quite unusual for him, yet the result is not an unconstrained artlessness, but a style which is affected and fanciful. Exaggerated declarations of gratitude and protestations of his devotion are repeatedly shown." Unquote. That Wesley had more invested in this relationship than simply the role of religious tutor is clear. He rationalized his continued intense relationships with the young women of Cotswold, and especially with Aspasia, by putting them on a pedestal of holiness and viewing them as necessary inspiration for his own struggle with the world. As the relationship with Mary Pendarvis deepened, he expressed both the depths of his feeling and the fear that he is opening himself to be hurt again. Quote, "I perceive that I am making another avenue for grief, that I am laying open another part of my soul, at which the arrows of fortune may enter. Tell me, if it be a fault that my heart burns within me when I reflect on the many marks of regard you have already shown." Unquote. His fears proved well-founded. By 1734, the press of social life in higher circles had dampened the young widow's interest in maintaining her correspondence with Wesley, and she became increasingly lax in answering his letters. Wesley read between the lines of her apology and terminated the relationship with his reply, "Doubtless you acted upon cool reflection. You declined the trouble of writing not because it was a trouble, but because it was a needless one. I sincerely thank you for what is past." Unquote. In closing his discussion of these relationships, Green concludes that, quote, "It is perhaps fanciful to assume that unrequited love helped to create the mental state which made him ready to leave England and Oxford for what he fondly, if inaccurately, believed to be the primitive innocence of America. There, as he told Dr. Burton, he might be able to attain such a purity of thought as suits a candidate for that state wherein they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven." Unquote. There is little doubt that leaving for Georgia marked, among other things, an attempt on Wesley's part to solve the problem of intimacy by evading it. Schmidt has noted that Wesley hoped that Georgia would give him an opportunity to be free of all the ties with the female sex, since in his fantasy of the colony there would be no women of his own race. We shall soon turn to an examination of other factors which were involved in the decision to go to Georgia, and then to an analysis of the significant Georgia experience itself. It is appropriate at this point, however, to call attention to the structuring of Wesley's movements in attempting to come to terms with an important life task, that of achieving sexual intimacy. We have seen that Wesley's childhood was one of continual interaction with a small group of sensitive and religious female companions. He learned to prefer the company of women and to thrive on it. There was no conflict in the childhood home between religious purity and commitment and intimate relationships with the opposite sex. With the onset of adolescence, however, the bliss of a conflict-free relationship with female peers was to come to an end. His mother had taught him to equate sinful willfulness with bodily passion, and to associate both with a a hellish conflagration from which, if one is to fulfill his religious vocation, he must be, quote, plucked as a brand from the burning, unquote. In spite of his mother's careful and for the most part successful attempts to bridle his passions and channel them into religious expressions and commitments, we've seen that the creative and imaginative John found ways at least to approach intimacy with young women. Given the warning to beware of Delilahs and the sirens of the carnal, he chose to associate with young women who had such traits that he could rationalize the pleasure of their company as either necessary inspiration for his own religious pilgrimage or as a natural outgrowth of his responsibility to serve as a spiritual guide to others. In Wesley's attempt to meet the life task of finding psychosexual intimacy, then, we see that a major part of his lifelong adaptive strategy has already been formulated. In order to make a legitimate place for natural passion, its threads are woven carefully into the fabric of the unquestioned passion of his religious commitments. A psychological Trojan horse tactic is manifest here, with the sexual smuggled within the vehicle of the spiritual in order to deceive both himself and others. We will have occasion to discuss this adaptive stratagem at length in our discussion of his relationship with Sophie Hopke. At this point, however, it should be noted that Wesley's attempts to deceive others were less successful than those at self-deception, and even his self-deception often proved unequal to his assaults of conscience. A recurrent fear is summarized by the question Wesley put to himself, quote, have I loved women or company more than God? Unquote. If we interpret the precocious conscience evident alongside his attempts to achieve psychosexual intimacy as an internalized expression of the maternal authority, then the reason for the choice of a subtitle for this section will become evident. The only front in which John Wesley tested the boundaries established by his mother during his development was that involving intimacy with women, despite his employment of evasive and functionally compensatory strategies in order to avoid the painful confrontations with conscience. Wesley returned to direct assaults on the barriers between him and psychosexual fulfillment in his adult and later middle-aged life. In this writer's opinion, he came closest to a successful resolution of the psychosexual task in his engagement to Grace Murray, with this promising relationship aborted through the manifestation of Wesley's long operative tendency toward hesitation and indecision in such matters. Coupled with the machinations of his brother, Charles, he lost the opportunity for conjugal fulfillment, which had long been a frustrating preoccupation. Finally, throwing all caution to the winds, Wesley married a woman uniquely ill-suited to allow him integration of his need for psychosexual fulfillment with his commitment to his chosen professional identity. Wesley then, in fact, never won his struggle on the one front in which he felt compelled to resist the internalized maternal authority. We shall see how this same protracted struggle manifested itself in Georgia through his relationship with Sophie Hopke, and how it figured in the attractiveness of the revival as Wesley finalized his formulation of personal and professional identity. Wesley and conflict with paternal authority. If the summer of 1726 provides a poignant glimpse of the struggle between conscience and the carnal in Wesley's ill-fated resistance to maternal authority. It also provides us with a veritable scenario with which to grasp the basic structure of his successful resistance to paternal authority. The event which provides us with such a helpful insight into John Wesley's tactics in dealing with his father, we have denoted the Hetty incident. Though the lives of all of Wesley's sisters were marked by tragedy and acute unhappiness, the story of Hetty Wesley has been viewed as the saddest. While Hetty was from all accounts a quite intelligent and attractive young lady, she seemed to chafe under the restrictions of parental authority, and particularly that of her father. She fell in love with a young lawyer who was apparently intensely disliked by her father. Forbidden to see him, she met him secretly and soon spent a night with him. The family was scandalized, but none so explosively as the father. His disgust at her behavior was monumental, and he subsequently forced her to marry a drunken and insensitive man that she hardly knew. As if this were not punishment enough, Samuel and most of the rest of the household continued to withhold their forgiveness and affection months after the marriage. When John arrived at Epworth for his visit during the summer of 1726, he was shocked to find that his sister Mary was the only family member who had forgiven Hetty and re-established an open and constructive relationship with her. He began to try to reason with his father and the others, but even as the summer drew to a close, Samuel was still unrelenting in his condemnation of Hetty. On Sunday, August 28th, John took the case to the pulpit, taking as his topic, Universal Charity, or the Charity Due to Wicked Persons. He had consulted his mother on the sermon, and after she read it, she commented, "You writ this sermon for Hetty. The rest was brought in for the sake of the last paragraph." John seemed to believe that his appeal to reason and conscience would change his father's mind. He was gravely mistaken. His father was so angry that he would not speak to John concerning the matter, but confided his anger and hurt with John to Charles, lamenting John's disrespect and deliberate defiance. Quote, "Every day you hear how he contradicts me, and takes your sister's part before my face. Nay, he disputes with me. Preach." Unquote. Though the account has him not finishing the sentence, he clearly was communicating his shock that John had the audacity to preach a sermon calling him to repentance. Charles communicated his father's hurt and anger to John, and strangely enough, John was surprised at the intensity of his father's response. He had obviously believed that his sermon had already softened his father's stance not only toward Hetty, but toward the offending young lawyer as well. Quote, "I had the same day the pleasure of observing that my father, the same day, when one Will Atkins was mentioned, did not speak so warmly nor largely against him as usual." Unquote. He now found that his father was, quote, "speaking warmly and largely," unquote, against the would-be agent of reconciliation. John's response at this point is of focal interest to the psychohistorian. Instead of standing pat upon realizing the alienating effects of his assertiveness toward his father, John went immediately to him and apologized for his offense. He promised that he would never contradict his father again, and offered to do penance to demonstrate his sincerity by transcribing for his father as often as he wished. The apology brought about a tearful reconciliation, sealed with a filial kiss and with a transcribing assignment for the next day. Samuel's statement that he had always known that John was good at bottom was certainly faint enough praise, but indicated that he thought John's rebellion against his authority was terminated. However, in spite of the fact that John did diligently transcribe for his father during the remainder of his stay at Epworth, he chose as his final sermon topic, rash judging. This parting blow angered Samuel so much that he protested to Samuel Jr., indicating that John's rebellion against his authority had gone so far as to break a canon of the law of the Church of England. He invoked the 53rd canon, which stipulated that no preacher shall, quote, of purpose, impugn, confute any doctrine delivered by any other preacher in the same church, unquote. It was clear that John had not been successful in subjugating his reason and conscience to what he felt to be the irresponsible and abusive authority of his father. Yet it was equally clear that open conflict with his father, even when John was sure that Samuel was misusing his parental and ecclesiastical authority, continued to be extremely painful for him and required a price of penance to be paid for his challenge to that authority. The determination to resist all capricious and uncharitable authority was to continue throughout his life. We shall see, however, that the need to do penance for his resistance continues only through the Georgia experience and terminates at Aldersgate. The Heady incident has in effect provided us with an understanding of the continuing struggle of John Wesley to master the challenge presented by the potent but unpredictable person of his father. We have seen that John early became adept at the use of reason and argument from a coherent religious perspective in making his way through his experienced life space. We have also seen that Susanna, consistently and with varying degrees of success, used this tactic in order to limit the effects of Samuel's caprice. We may conclude at this point that Wesley chose very early in life to cast his lot with the moral order which Susanna had created in the nursery, and that he had, in formulating his unique style of ego-synthesis and adaptation, committed himself to carrying the principles of that microcosmic moral order to their logical conclusions in the world beyond. We shall see the ramifications of his chosen adaptive style as they figure in his mature self-image as a religious leader in his fully formed understanding of the soteriological economy. At this point, however, we are still contemplating a young John Wesley who has not yet laid the potency of the paternal authority to rest. We now turn to the last real internal conflict with that authority. In this decisive sequence of events, the stakes for the formation of Wesley's personal and professional identity were far higher than those in the Heady incident. By 1733, the health of Samuel Wesley was failing, and, concerned about the continuing welfare of his family in the event of his death, he began to seek a successor from his sons to take over the Epworth living. He first asked Samuel Jr., but he declined since he had just taken a position as a headmaster of a school. Charles was not yet ordained, and therefore an attempt was made to enlist John to become the successor. With this request, a struggle was engaged between Wesley and his father, which was to extend until his father's death in 1735, and which had ramifications extending to the Aldersgate experience and beyond. John was at first not totally resistant to the idea, and seemed to be considering it. Nevertheless, in correspondence with his mother, he expressed some doubt regarding his ability to handle the assignment and communicated some of his grounds for not readily wanting to leave Oxford. Quote, "If I knew I could stand my ground here and to prove myself a faithful minister of our blessed Jesus, then there was not a place under heaven like this for improvement in every good work." Unquote. Samuel, of course, was not one who would take a weak refusal as final. He wrote to John pointing out that his recalcitrance was jeopardizing all of the accomplishments of his 40 years of ministry. The implicit appeal to consider the welfare of Susanna and the sisters who remained at home was understood by the whole family, and given John's unquestioned affection for the women of his family, must have tugged heavily at his resolve to stay at Oxford. If seen in the context of the Hetty incident, this struggle was undoubtedly the source of extreme pressures of conscience and guilt for the sensitive son and brother. He had criticized his father during the earlier conflict for lack of charity and failure to live up to the responsibilities of a loving and just father. And even then, when he was sure he was in the right, he was beset by waves of guilt for angering his father and made amends by working on one of his father's literary projects. Now, however, it was he who seemed uncharitable and irresponsible toward the family, and instead of being asked to assist in a literary project, he was being called upon to recant and to salvage the most important project of his father's life, his ministry, and to secure the livelihood of his beloved mother and the sisters who remained at home. Nevertheless, this time Wesley stood fast under the pressure which continued month after month. In December of 1734, he wrote a letter to his father which was an all-out attempt to put the issue to rest. It was his purpose in the letter to offer a comprehensive and carefully reasoned justification on religious grounds of his decision not to leave Oxford. Here we see the mature flowering of Wesley's lifelong tactic of using reasoned argument to limit the effectiveness of his father's authority. Under 25 points, he presented the reasons why he could not in good conscience accept a living at Epworth. He began by claiming that the glory of God was in fact his only real consideration. This end of glorifying God demanded first of all that he cultivate holiness in himself, so that he might better foster it in others. At Oxford, he points out, he has an ideal setting for his own spiritual pilgrimage. He has a regular income and is free from the more mundane cares of the world, free from trifling acquaintance. He always has additional company. He always has inspirational company. Quote, "I know no other place under heaven where I can have always at hand half a dozen persons nearly of my own judgment and engaged in the same studies, persons who are awakened into a full and lively conviction that they have only one work to do upon earth, who have, according to their power, renounced themselves and wholly and absolutely devoted themselves to God." Unquote. In addition to such inspiring company, opportunities for cultivating his coveted personal holiness abounded. Not only did he have myriad opportunities for corporate worship, but also for engaging in good works. Quote, "There is scarce any way of doing good which here is not daily occasion. Here are poor families to be relieved, here are children to be educated, here are workhouses wherein both young and old want and gladly receive the word of exhortation Here are persons to be visited, wherein alone is a complication of all human wants. And lastly, here are the schools of the prophets. Here are the tender minds to be formed and strengthened, and babes in Christ to be instructed and perfected in all useful learning. Unquote. John had earlier pled to his father the spiritual significance of the opposition to which the Holy Club member was subject at Oxford. For John, this represented the persecution which he believed to be inevitable in the life of a Christian. Samuel Wesley's reply was a telling one, and necessitated a quite involved evasion in John's response. The father had noted that while most of the parishioners were eager for John to succeed him, in a parish of 2,000 souls there would certainly be plenty persecution. In his circuitous reply, John questioned both his ability to minister to such a large group of people and their sincerity in wanting him as their pastor. In support of this apprehension, he reminded his father of the persecution that Samuel had received at their hands. Yet he continued to affirm the spiritual importance of persecution, and concluded that while Epworth did not promise opposition, at Oxford he had it already. In a subsequent letter to his mother, he went on to argue that he could be replaced more easily at Epworth than at Oxford, that in working with students he could sweeten the fountain rather than try to purify the myriad streams. Despite all his apparent resolve and commitment to staying at Oxford, Wesley apparently had some reservations with regard to his position on the matter. When his brother Samuel took his father's side and questioned the sincerity of John's stated reasons for his refusal, the increased pressure evidently raised doubts in John's own mind. In the end, Wesley recanted his irrevocable commitment to the Oxford life and indicated his willingness to reconsider his father's request. In this case, however, as in many others, Wesley had allowed his own hesitance and indecision to decide the matter for him. By the time he had decided to open himself to submitting to his father's wishes, the living had already been promised to another candidate. The question of the basis for Wesley's refusal to succeed his father is an important one, and we must consider what the request must have meant to him at this important juncture in his personal and professional development. For the psychohistorian, two factors stand out here as important contributing factors: Wesley's own sense of a special destiny and the shared family assumption that their father had abilities and potential which were frustrated by the effectual exile of Epworth. With regard to Wesley's prodigious sense of a special destiny, we must agree with Wesley that the analysis should begin prior to his birth. First of all, most biographers have missed the reason that Wesley, contrary to all the other children, was given a middle name. That middle name, Benjamin, was the name of the infant boy who immediately preceded John and who died in infancy. The psychological significance of this naming has been lost, even on those who have noticed it. Specialists in the psychodynamic significance of birth order have noted that a child born immediately after the death of a preceding sibling often is treated in a manner which indicates the heightened significance of the child for his parent, living in effect for two persons, in this case John and Benjamin. The child is early predisposed toward having an exaggerated sense of uniqueness and corresponding destiny. When this fact of Wesley's position at birth is combined with the circumstances related above, which led to his conception, we see that the beginnings of Wesley's sense of destiny probably has roots antedating the miraculous rescue of 1709. We have already noted the primary significance of John's experience of being a, quote, brand plucked from the burning, unquote, both for his mother and for their relationship. This experience and the continual later reference to it indicate clearly that John early came to have a sense of a special religious destiny captured in his image of having been saved by God and set aside for a most providential role. Having grasped the high expectations Wesley had for himself, we are led to ask why the prospect of succeeding his father at Epworth seems so inappropriate to him. In order to understand Wesley's rejection of the living, we must look not simply at his lengthy statements regarding his motives, but rather at the meaning Epworth had for Wesley given his search for that providential special role. We ask, therefore, if the family circle shared any particular viewpoint regarding the appropriateness of the Epworth appointment for Samuel Sr. Upon examination, it is clear that there did exist an agreement in the family that the parish ministry at Epworth did not facilitate the fulfillment of the potential of the father. For all of Susanna's awareness of her husband's faults, she thought it a great waste that he had to spend his life in the parish ministry at Epworth. Quote, and did I not know that Almighty Wisdom hath views and ends in fixing the bounds of our habitation, which are out of our ken? I should think it 1,000 pities that a man of his brightness and rare endowments of learning and useful knowledge in relation to the Church of God should be confined to an obscure corner of the country where his talents are buried, and he determined to a way of life for which he is not so well qualified as I could wish. The rector himself had long had fantasies of an escape from Epworth. At the time of the acute marital conflict related above, Samuel was thinking of returning to the naval chaplaincy. Early in his career, he had been disappointed in his hopes of becoming a bishop, and for a large part of his career he had entertained elaborate fantasies of leaving Epworth for the mission field. He had proposed several schemes to the Society for propagating the gospel in foreign parts, including missions to India, China, or Abyssinia. In his old age, he was an enthusiastic supporter of Oglethorpe's plans for a Georgia colony and lamented his frustrated hopes of becoming a missionary in such a promising field. In a letter to Oglethorpe in 1734, he revealed his continuing excitement about the challenge of a mission to the, quote, heathen. I had always so dear a love of your colony that if it had been but 10 years ago I would gladly have devoted the remainder of my life and labors to that place, and think I might before this time have conquered the language without which little can be done among the natives. Unquote. Samuel sought unsuccessfully to have his son-in-law, John Whitelam, chosen to go with Oglethorpe, that he might at least have a vicarious participation in a project which had all the marks of his own frustrated fantasy. We now have a vantage point from which we can understand not only John Wesley's reluctance to accept the Epworth living, but also an important and heretofore neglected ingredient in his decision to undertake the Georgia mission. It is clear that Wesley had a developed sense of personal destiny that required a role which would have the marks of being special or extraordinary. And it is equally clear that the general conclusion of the family was that being rector of Epworth was not a role which facilitated the fulfillment of the potential of its occupant. Seen in this perspective, Wesley's decision to reject the living is quite understandable. Epworth had frustrated the dreams of his father, but he was determined that it was not to frustrate his own. The decision to reject the living, however, was a costly one for Wesley. We have seen in our discussion of the Hetty incident that John did not take overt conflict with his father lightly. Even when his father was guilty of irresponsible conduct toward a family member, John's conduct necessitated doing penance through working on one of his father's pet projects. Now, Wesley had, in rejecting the living, not only effectually raised a question regarding the worth of his father's lifelong labor at Epworth, but also, in so doing, he had cast himself in the role of the insensitive and irresponsible family member. Such a transgression of the will of his father would no doubt require an act of penance that no amount of transcribing on job could ever satisfy. Opportunities for such attempts at a satisfactory reconciliation were to be cut short by the death of Samuel on April 25th, 1735. After his father's funeral, John transcribed on the dissertations in Librum Jobi until it was finished and ready for publishing. While visiting in Westminster making arrangements for its publication, Wesley was contacted by Dr. John Burton on behalf of the trustees of the colony of Georgia and asked to accompany Oglethorpe to Georgia as missionary to the Indians and pastor to Savannah. After 10 days of consultations with his mother and a number of friends, Wesley accepted the offer of the Georgia trustees. On October 14th, 1735, John and Charles Wesley were among the passengers of the Simmons as it began its journey to Georgia. The question of why Wesley chose to leave Oxford so soon after having declared his irrevocable commitment to stay there has long figured as a primary puzzle for Wesley scholars. No doubt, there had been some internal difficulties within the ranks of the Holy Club, but it would be stretching the evidence too far to suggest that such difficulties alone would have led John to abandon the club in the midst of a challenge to his leadership ability. We have noted above that Wesley's frustrated relationships with the opposite sex had undoubtedly rendered an opportunity to get away from women of, quote, his own kind, unquote, an attractive option. But his most lengthy protestations of intent to remain at Oxford were written after the relationship with Aspasia had drawn to a close. His most lengthy protestations of intent to remain at Oxford were written after the relationship with Aspasia had drawn to a close. While affirming the role of these previously noted ingredients in the decision, I propose an additional interpretation. In deciding to undertake a mission to the Indians, Wesley was also engaging in an act of penance on a grand scale. Taking on the challenge of a mission to the Indians enabled Wesley to work on a pet project of his father's fantasies. It can be seen as an attempt by Wesley to do for his father that which Samuel himself was never able to do, but which he considered an extraordinary ministry of highest priority. Wesley's rejection of the Epworth living and his subsequent acceptance of the Georgia mission then was a complex but understandable unfolding of his struggle with the difficult task of finding an acceptable personal and vocational identity. The call to Epworth offered little to Wesley in the task of ego synthesis and identity formation. First, it offered a role that Wesley knew had proven to be the bane of his father's ambitions for greatness. Given his own need to find a special or extraordinary role for himself, this alone would probably have been sufficient cause for him to reject the living. Second, the Oxford experience functioned as an extended psychosocial moratorium for Wesley, and he was reluctant to take on an unpromising assignment which would entail resigning his fellowship and the security and flexibility which it provided. He could accept the Georgia mission while simply on a leave of absence from Oxford. If it did not prove to be a successful experiment, he could always return to Oxford. Third, Epworth had been the scene of some of his most guilt-ridden encounters with young women. In his fantasies, Georgia offered him an opportunity to lay aside the immensely frustrating task of coming to terms with psychosexual intimacy. This attempted avoidance of his sexuality, combined in the same movement with a choice of an extraordinary mode of ministry enthusiastically sanctioned by his mother, indicates that the decision to go to Georgia was fully in accord with the dictates of the maternal authority. And lastly, the decision for the Georgia mission marked an attempt to do penance for his blatant transgression of paternal authority.